The air was thick with tension even before she opened her mouth. Cameras zoomed in, microphones leaned forward, and the crowd leaned back in anticipation of another Kari Lake performance. But no one expected the sheer ferocity of what came next. Lake's voice tore through the room like shattered glass, shrill, unrelenting, her words ricocheting off the walls as though volume alone could replace substance. She was not speaking. She was shouting, clawing at control, every syllable dripping with contempt. The veins in her neck strained as she jabbed her finger in the air, desperate to dominate the moment. The audience froze, caught between disbelief and discomfort. Some shifted nervously in their seats, others glanced toward the cameras, already sensing this was about to become more than just another political clash. The sheer spectacle of it was enough to make headlines before the evening was over. Kari Lake wasn't just raising her voice, she was unraveling in real time, exposing the raw desperation of someone who confuses rage with power. Her words blurred together in a furious crescendo, a storm that seemed to go on without end, and yet, for all the sound and fury, there was a hollowness beneath its emptiness that could not be disguised by sheer volume. Every second she screamed, the silence of those around her grew heavier, louder, more cutting. It was as though the room itself was rejecting the performance, refusing to validate the theater of arrogance on display. Then came the freeze-frame moment. The instant when the camera lingered on her contorted face, mid-scream, eyes wide with fury. A moment that begged to be clipped, shared, memed, dissected. The kind of image that social media devours. And in that single frozen second, a question hung in the air. How could anyone respond to this storm without being swallowed whole? The answer was not force against force, not fire against fire. It was something far more powerful, something the screaming could never anticipate. Because what happened in the next few seconds would leave the entire room and the entire internet in shock. The silence after Lake's eruption felt heavier than the scream itself. It wasn't just about one woman shouting in a room. It was about what that shouting represented. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every angle of her fury. And in living rooms across America, viewers leaned closer to their screens. They knew this wasn't simply another heated exchange. It was a reflection of a deeper battle over dignity, identity, and who truly gets to define the American story. Because Kari Lake wasn't just raising her voice at Jasmine Crockett. She was echoing a pattern too familiar in American politics. The attempt to drown out a new kind of voice. A voice that comes from lived struggle, not privilege. A voice that speaks with the authority of experience, not entitlement. And in that moment, every progressive, every immigrant family, every person who had ever been told to sit down and be quiet could see the symbolism unfolding before their eyes. The stakes were more than personal. They were generational. Lake's outburst represented the old guard, loud, domineering, unwilling to concede space. Crockett's stillness represented something new, confident, steady, not needing to scream to be heard. It was as though history itself had staged this confrontation, placing arrogance on one side of the table and resilience on the other. And the room became the stage for a drama larger than the two women themselves. The audience sensed it. Commentators in their seats scribbled faster. Reporters on their phones sent hurried updates to editors. Even those who disliked politics could feel the electricity of the moment. This wasn't going to fade into obscurity. This was the kind of clash that lives on in headlines, hashtags, and late-night talk shows. And what made it even more gripping was the imbalance in energy. Lake had unleashed her fury early, her voice spent, her performance exposed. Crockett, by contrast, had yet to move, yet to speak, yet to show even the slightest crack in her composure. The anticipation built like a drumbeat. When would she answer, and how? That tension pulled viewers deeper into the moment. It wasn't just about who would win the argument. It was about whether the forces of rage and noise could finally be undone by calm, unshakable truth. Every second stretched longer, every breath carried more weight. But beneath the silence, a current of inevitability surged. Kari Lake believed she had seized control by sheer force of voice. Yet anyone watching closely could see it, control was already slipping from her hands. The crowd wasn't on her side. The moment wasn't bending to her will. The camera wasn't capturing strength. It was capturing desperation. And as the tension grew unbearable, as the audience leaned forward waiting for the storm to be answered, the stage belonged entirely to Jasmine Crockett. The silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. And that strategy was about to turn Lake's scream into her own undoing. Because when Crockett finally chose to respond, she would not only answer Kari Lake, she would answer an entire culture of arrogance. With a reply that would echo far beyond those four walls, and that reply, piercing, unforgettable, was about to change everything. To understand the weight of Kari Lake's meltdown, you have to step back and look at the path that brought her to this very stage. Kari Lake wasn't always the figure who screamed her way into headlines. Once she was a polished local news anchor in Arizona, projecting calm authority from behind a desk, reading the teleprompter with practiced poise. But television can teach a dangerous lesson that attention is power. And when Lake left journalism behind to plunge into politics, she carried with her not just a taste for the spotlight, but a conviction that the louder she was, the more she mattered. From the moment she hit the campaign trail, Lake embraced confrontation. As theater, her rallies became stages, her podiums became pulpits. She learned to weaponize outrage, to turn anger into applause, to make volume substitute for vision. And it worked for a time. She drew headlines, built a loyal base, and styled herself as a fighter against the so-called elites who, in her telling, were destroying America. But beneath the polished branding, a pattern emerged. When cornered, when challenged. When faced with facts she could not bend, Kari Lake screamed. This wasn't a flaw she stumbled into. It became her entire persona. Supporters called it strength. Critics saw it as theater, but anyone who looked closely could see the desperation woven into the fabric of her rage. Every eruption was a shield, hiding the absence of answers. Every shout was a diversion from the hollowness underneath. And in politics, patterns matter. Lake's career became defined not by the calm delivery of solutions, but by the spectacle of conflict. It was a politics of volume, a politics of intimidation, a politics of drowning out dissenting voices with sheer force. That's the problem. In the age of viral moments, the louder you scream, the easier it is to be exposed. One clip, one freeze frame, can shatter the image of strength and reveal the fragility beneath. That fragility had been glimpsed before moments where Lake lashed out at reporters, belittled opponents, or shouted down critics. Each time, her followers cheered, mistaking chaos for courage. But for millions of Americans watching outside that bubble, those moments raised a different question. If you need to scream to be heard, do you actually have anything to say? That question loomed over this confrontation with Jasmine Crockett. Lake stepped into the room with her trademark fire, confident she could dominate the exchange by sheer force of personality. She believed volume was victory, that shouting would send her opponent retreating into silence. But she didn't understand that Crockett's silence wasn't surrender, it was patience. And patience, in this moment, was power. Lake's backstory matters because it exposes the deeper symbolism of this clash. She represents the old guard of politics, leaders who mistake anger for authenticity, who confuse dominance with leadership, who believe control belongs to the one who speaks the loudest. But America is shifting. A new generation of voices, measured, diverse, unafraid, are proving that dignity doesn't need a megaphone to echo. And so, as the cameras caught Lake mid-scream, veins straining, face contorted, the weight of her entire career bore down on her. She wasn't just screaming at Jasmine Crockett. She was screaming at the inevitability of change, the collapse of an old political playbook, the rising tide of a future where shouting isn't enough. But Lake couldn't see that. She believed this was her moment of triumph. She believed that headlines would praise her fire, that her base would revel in the spectacle, that silence meant victory. What she didn't realize was that silence was the setup, and in the pause after her fury and the stillness before Crockett spoke, Kari Lake's entire strategy was about to collapse. because arrogance always underestimates composure.
Ow.
And in a battle between noise and truth, the scream may grab attention, but it is the reply that history remembers. To truly feel the impact of Jasmine Crockett's reply, you have to know who she is, not just the congresswoman on a stage, but the woman who walked through fire to stand there with unshakable calm. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin with cameras or microphones. It begins in the heart of Texas, where she grew up watching communities like hers fight to be heard in a world that often refused to listen. From a young age, she understood what it meant to exist in spaces that weren't built for her, and she carried with her the stubborn refusal to shrink. Before politics, there was the law. Crockett built her reputation not as a performer, but as a fighter for the vulnerable, taking on cases for those who couldn't afford the expensive defense of privilege. In courtrooms, she learned that the most powerful voice isn't always the loudest one. It's the voice that stays steady when challenged, the one that turns facts into shields, the one that wins not through volume, but through clarity. She didn't just practice law, she practiced resilience. Every cross-examination prepared her for moments like this, where arrogance would try to rattle her, and composure would be her answer. Her rise into politics was never guaranteed. She wasn't born into connections or wealth. She carved her place out of persistence, grit, and the conviction that service meant speaking truth, even when it came at a cost. For Jasmine, the mission was always bigger than herself. It was about representation, the simple but radical idea that people who looked like her, who lived like her, deserved a seat at the table where decisions were made. That's what made her presence in this clash so symbolic. Kari Lake entered the room with a history of microphones and spotlights, a career built on spectacle. Jasmine Crockett entered with scars, lessons, and a calm sharpened by battles that never made headlines. She didn't need to perform. Her very existence in that room was already a defiance of the old order. Her style in politics reflected her journey. While others thrived on theatrics, Crockett thrived on precision. She became known for her sharp questioning in hearings, her refusal to be bullied into silence, her ability to cut through chaos with a single line that left opponents fumbling. But what stood out wasn't just her skill, it was her composure. Even under fire, even when provoked, Crockett refused to give away her power. That refusal became her signature strength. It's easy to underestimate someone who doesn't scream back. It's easy to mistake calm for weakness. But Jasmine Crockett had learned long ago that real power lies in restraint. Let others waste their energy. Let others unravel themselves. She would wait, she would watch, and then, at the precise moment, she would strike with words that carried more weight than 100 shouts ever could. And that's exactly what made the tension in the room unbearable after Lake's eruption. Crockett had not flinched. She hadn't rolled her eyes, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even shifted her posture. She sat, poised, letting the storm pass over her as though she had weathered storms far greater. And in truth, she had. Compared to the systemic barriers, the courtroom battles, the uphill climb of making her way into Congress, Kari Lake's outburst was little more than background noise. For the audience, for the millions watching online, Crockett's silence was riveting. They saw themselves in it. They remembered the times they had been shouted down, dismissed, underestimated, and they leaned in, knowing instinctively what Lake could not, that silence was not defeat. It was preparation. What made Jasmine Crockett a hero in that moment wasn't just her calm reply, but the life that gave birth to it. She didn't need to shout because she had already survived louder storms. She didn't need to force control because she embodied it. She didn't need to perform for cameras because her entire career was proof that she belonged there. So is Kari Lake's scream. Echoed and faded, Jasmine Crockett's story lingered in the silence that followed. The story of a woman who rose from the margins to the center stage, who turned struggle into strength, who carried with her not just her own dignity, but the dignity of every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And it was this story, the foundation of resilience that made her uniquely prepared for the moment that was about to unfold. Because when she finally opened her mouth to respond, she would not only defend herself, she would carry with her the voices of countless others, and she would answer arrogance with the kind of power that doesn't fade, The stage was set. The scream had been delivered. But history was about to remember the reply. The silence after Kari Lake's scream didn't last long. She wasn't finished. Fueled by her own adrenaline, she leaned in again, her voice cracking with intensity, words tumbling over each other as if sheer velocity could disguise their emptiness. Each sentence was an accusation, each phrase a jab. She circled like a fighter throwing wild punches, desperate to land a blow before her opponent even lifted a hand. But the more she raged, the more the imbalance became clear. This wasn't a debate anymore, it was a spectacle. One woman unraveling in front of cameras. The other sitting calm, unmoved, unreadable. Lake's tone shifted from loud to shrill, then to mocking, then back to loud again. She waved her arms, her expression sharp, her body language screaming domination. She was trying to bait Jasmine Crockett, trying to force her into the same chaos, to drag her into the mud where volume reigned supreme. Yet Crockett refused. Her face was steady, her eyes unblinking, her composure almost unsettling. She didn't so much as twitch. She let Lake burn herself out, let the audience feel the desperation behind the noise. The crowd could feel it. Tension rippled through the room like static. You could hear the nervous shifting of feet, the awkward clearing of throats, the hushed whispers between onlookers. They weren't reacting to Crockett, they were reacting to Lake's unraveling. Still, the Congresswoman said nothing. Oh, that silence was louder than any counterpunch could have been in that moment. It was strategy. It was discipline. It was power. Lake kept pressing. She hurled insults, painted herself as the victim of some imagined slight, tried to twist the narrative into one where her screaming was righteous. But the harder she tried, the more her words rang hollow. You could see it in the faces around. The cameras didn't lie. People weren't nodding in agreement. They were watching in disbelief. They weren't inspired. They were uncomfortable. And then something remarkable began to happen. The room, which had once been Lake's stage, shifted its focus. The cameras panned not to the screamer, but to the silent figure beside her. Viewers leaned in, waiting for Jasmine Crockett to break the silence. Every second stretched longer, like the pause before a verdict. It was as if the nation itself was holding its breath. Kari Lake, blinded by her own fury, didn't notice the shift. She believed she still held control, that by speaking the loudest she was shaping the story. But the story had already moved past her. All eyes were on Crockett, now not because of what she had said, but because of what she hadn't said. The suspense was unbearable, and in that unbearable silence, the anticipation reached its peak. The crowd knew it. The cameras knew it. Social media, already buzzing, was on the edge of explosion. Jasmine Crockett was about to speak, and when she did, the moment would shatter Kari Lake's performance and transform into something far bigger than either of them. The scream had set the stage, the silence had built the tension. And now the reply was coming. When Jasmine Crockett finally moved, it wasn't with the theatrics Kari Lake had demanded. She didn't slam her hand on the desk. She didn't raise her voice to match the chaos. She simply leaned forward ever so slightly, the kind of gesture so subtle it almost felt unplanned, and then calmly, evenly, with a voice steady as stone, she began to speak. The contrast was electric. Where Lake's words had been a storm, Crockett's voice was the eye of it still, clear, undeniable. The room, which had just been vibrating with noise, shifted into absolute silence. Every camera caught it. Every microphone recorded it. Words landed not because they were shouted, but because they cut through the air with precision, each one deliberate, each one sharp enough to slice through the fog of rage. Crockett didn't waste her breath, countering every insult. She didn't lower herself into the mud of pettiness. Instead, she chose one line, one point, one truth so undeniable that it stripped Lake's performance bare. She reminded everyone why they were there, what the issue actually was, and why shouting would never replace substance. Her delivery was steady, almost surgical. Each word tightening the noose Lake had unknowingly tied for herself. For a split second, Lake tried to interject, her voice rising again. But this time, the energy had shifted. Her interruptions sounded hollow, desperate, like echoes of a performance that no longer commanded the stage. Crockett didn't raise her volume.
Oh, right.
She didn't even acknowledge the interruption. She simply continued speaking, her calm presence asserting dominance without effort. And in that refusal to play Lake's game, she dismantled the entire strategy before the audience's eyes. The crowd's reaction was palpable. Gasps at first, then murmurs, then a wave of suppressed laughter as people realized what was happening. The scream that had been meant to dominate the night was unraveling in real time, undone by the calmest voice in the room. The silence that followed Crockett's words wasn't awkward, it was reverent. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've just witnessed something they'll remember for years. And Crockett wasn't finished. She paused, let the silence linger, then delivered a second blow-knot with rage, but with dignity. She spoke to values, to truth, to the principle that leadership isn't about who can yell the loudest, but about who can remain grounded when chaos rises. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a moral lesson disguised as a counterattack. At that moment, you could see it in Kari Lake's face, the shift from defiance to frustration, from confidence to the creeping recognition that she had lost control of the narrative. Her eyes darted, her expression tightened, her hand twitched as if reaching for words that wouldn't come. The cameras, merciless as ever, captured every flicker of that unraveling, and Crockett knew it. Didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't spike the football. She didn't need to. Her composure itself was the victory. The dignity she carried made Lake's fury look childish, made the scream that opened the night look like a tantrum. The duel had been fought, but only one side had shown discipline, restraint, and power. For the audience both in the room and online, it felt like watching history crystallize. This wasn't just about Kari Lake versus Jasmine Crockett. It was about an old political language injure, domination, noise being eclipsed by a new one, calm, truth, dignity. Viewers didn't just see a politician winning an exchange. They saw a woman representing millions who'd been shouted over their entire lives, reclaiming space without ever raising her voice. The memes would come later, the clips, the hashtags, but in that room, in that moment, what mattered was the energy shift. Kari Lake's scream, intended as a weapon, had been turned into her undoing. JasmineCrockett's.com, her restraint, had transformed the exchange into a mic drop moment. One destined to ripple far beyond the walls of that chamber. And then, the final line measured, piercing, unforgettable Crockett sealed the moment. She didn't just dismantle Lake's argument. She reframed the entire night. She spoke not to her opponent, but to the audience, to the people watching at home, to the millions who would share the clip before the sun rose. It was the kind of closing line that ends a scene in a film, the kind that forces the credits to roll. The silence that followed was deafening. Lake had nothing left. No scream could follow it, no insult could undo it. The performance was over. And the cameras had already chosen their hero, and yet the story didn't end there. Because outside that room, beyond those walls, the internet was already stirring. Phones were buzzing, timelines filling, reactions spreading like wildfire. What had just unfolded wasn't going to stay in that chamber. It was about to explode into the digital bloodstream of the nation. And when it did, Kari Lake's scream would become a meme, but JasmineCrockett's.com would become a movement. It began the way every viral moment begins quietly. A few phones lifted, a few snippets posted online, a tweet here, a 30-second clip there. But within minutes, the air was electric. The internet alive with the sound of something bigger than just a political exchange. Kari Lake's scream and Jasmine Crockett's reply had leaped out of that chamber and into the bloodstream of a nation. Starving for a story, on Twitter, the first viral post was almost poetic. Kari Lake screamed. Jasmine Crockett whispered, "Guess who the world remembered?" It hit 50,000 likes in under an hour. Soon, hashtags flooded the platform. #.com_crush, #JasmineClapback, #Lake vs Crockett. Not just for Polly and Cry, not just for politics, but for a feeling of validation that dignity could still triumph over arrogance. TikTok lit up next. Teenagers and young activists clipped the exact moment Lake lost control and paired it with music. The captions with satirical edits. In one, Lake's scream was looped over and over until it blurred into absurdity, only to be cut short by Crockett's composed, devastating line, millions watched, millions shared. A new generation found its latest. You have to see this moment. And they weren't just laughing, they were inspired. Facebook groups buzzed. Family chats lit up. Did you see that exchange? Parents texted their kids. This is the woman I want representing us. One post read, shared 80,000 times by nightfall. The clips became Sunday dinner conversation, morning commute listening, and late-night group chat fodder. People who had never heard Jasmine Crockett's name before were suddenly Googling her biography, learning her story, watching every interview she had ever given. The media, hungry for the fire, swooped in like vultures to the flame. Headlines blared. Crockett silences Kari Lake with calm clapback. Screams versus substance. The viral showdown everyone's talking about. Cable news replayed the clip in loops, each anchor delivering their own stunned commentary. Some tried to spin it, but most couldn't escape the obvious truth. Jasmine Crockett had won the night. Kari Lake had lost it. But what made the moment stick wasn't just the humor or the shock. It was the resonance. It was immigrants, mothers, working-class Americans, people who had been shouted over, ignored, silenced, seeing themselves in Crockett's refusal to be rattled. They weren't just watching a politician win a debate. They were watching their own dignity reflected on the national stage. Commentators and celebrities piled on. A famous actress tweeted, "This is how you do it. Grace over noise, dignity over hate." A late-night host opened their monologue with a split screen of Lake screaming and Crockett's calm reply. The punchline needing no explanation, memes. Flooded Instagram. Crockett's serene face next to Lake's contorted yell. Captions reading, "Choose your fighter." And through it all, the emotional undertones swelled. For every laugh at Lake's tantrum, there was admiration for Crockett's calm. For every meme mocking the scream, there was a message about why composure matters, why truth matters, why representation matters. It wasn't just viral, it was meaningful. It reminded people of what politics could feel like when someone refused. To be dragged into the mud, the ripple effect reached even further. Donations to Crockett's campaign spiked overnight, small dollar contributions pouring in from across the country. Community groups organized watch parties for her past speeches. Influencers who rarely touched politics posted about the moment, urging their followers to watch this clip. It's what leadership looks like. Meanwhile, Lake's team scrambled to regain control, but every attempt at damage control only magnified the loss. Every time she spoke, clips of her scream resurfaced. Every denial, every deflection, every attempt to spin the narrative was drowned out by the simplicity of what the internet had already decided. She had lost the room, and no amount of noise could drown that out. By morning, Crockett's words were everywhere, quoted in headlines, stitched into TikToks, emblazoned on graphics. A phrase once spoken calmly in a chamber had become a slogan on posters, trending hashtags, even t-shirts overnight. It wasn't just an exchange anymore, it was a cultural flashpoint. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. This wasn't about a single scream, or even a single clapback. It was about the collision of two worlds, the politics of rage. And the politics of resolve. The world had chosen its hero. But for Jasmine Crockett, the story was just beginning. Because the internet might have crowned her the winner of the night, but the deeper question lingered, humming beneath the surface. What would she do with the power of this moment? And that question, more than anything, is what kept the nation watching. In the days that followed, as the hashtags trended and the memes multiplied, Jasmine Crockett did something remarkable. She refused to gloat. She didn't flood the airwaves with victory laps, nor did she bask in the spotlight of her newfound viral fame. Instead, she chose stillness. She chose to let the moment breathe, and in that space, people began to see the deeper lesson behind her composure. When she finally spoke publicly about the exchange, it wasn't with fire, but with clarity. "This was never about me," she said at a press conference, her voice calm yet resonant. "It was about the values we bring into the room. You can scream and you can shout, but in the end, it is dignity and truth that people remember." It wasn't a rebuke. It wasn't a spike of the football. It was a reminder. A reminder that politics doesn't have to be a battlefield of noise. It can be a stage where dignity is louder than rage. For her supporters, the words rang like a hymn. They weren't just celebrating her comeback against Kari Lake. They were internalizing it. They were thinking about the times in their own lives when they'd been shouted over, when they'd been underestimated, when they had been treated as less. Crockett's calm defiance became a mirror. She wasn't just a politician anymore. It was a symbol that one could stand tall, stand calm, and still win. And isn't that the story of so many Americans? The immigrant who built a business despite being told you don't belong. The young woman who was talked over in boardrooms but kept bringing better ideas until the room had no choice but to listen. The community leader who fought for funding against louder, wealthier voices and won. Crockett's reply wasn't just a clapback, it was an anthem for every person who has endured noise and met it with grace. The moral rippled outward. Composure is strength. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, Crockett proved that the strongest voice is often the calmest one. Her framing of the moment wasn't just about politics, but about humanity. Dignity, she said, isn't weakness. Dignity is power. Because when you hold your ground with calm, when you refuse to meet anger with anger, you don't just win the moment. You change the tone for everyone watching. And everyone had been watching. From the students who stitched her clip into their TikToks, the grandparents replaying her words on the evening news, the country had absorbed more than just a viral debate moment. They had absorbed a lesson in what it means to win without rage, to resist without screaming, to fight without lowering yourself. But beneath the inspiration was also a challenge. If Crockett could model composure in the face of rage, then what excuse did anyone else have? If she could stand her ground without losing her cool, what might it mean for ordinary people to do the same in their workplaces, in their families, in their communities? Her calm reply was not just a personal victory, it was a call to rise, a call to embody dignity as resistance. In the end, Kari Lake's scream faded into the background, a meme that would eventually grow stale. But Crockett's reply, rooted in dignity, became the lasting echo. It wasn't about volume, it was about values, and perhaps that's the most powerful moral of all. That in a country where so much of the political stage has become a circus of rage, there is still room, still hunger for a voice that chooses quiet strength over loud arrogance. For Jasmine Crockett, the viral moment was never the destination, it was only the beginning. The real story was what she chose to make of it, a chance to remind America that dignity is not just a personal trait, but a collective path forward. Because sometimes, the calmest voice in the room carries the heaviest weight, and the nation was left asking itself, if composure can silence rage in a single chamber, what else might it change across the country? The clip that started with Kari Lake's scream and ended with JasmineCrockett's.com reply had now traveled through every corner of the internet. But here's the truth. This was never just about one exchange in one room. This was about who we are as a country, which voices we choose to amplify. Jasmine didn't just win a debate moment. She reminded us of something far larger. That dignity can silence arrogance, that truth can outlast noise, and that when leaders refuse to lower themselves to chaos, they give the rest of us permission to rise higher too. And that's why this story matters. Because it's not just entertainment, it's a reflection of what we want our politics and our nation to look like. Do we want leaders who scream or leaders who stand? Do we want noise or do we want clarity? Do we want division or do we want dignity? That choice doesn't just play out on debate stages. It plays out in every election, in every community, and in every conversation we have with one another. Which means it's not just on Jasmine Crockett to carry that torch, it's on us. So if this moment inspired you found yourself nodding at her composure, sharing her words, or even just wishing we had more leaders like her, then don't. Let it stop here. Share this video. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that matter. Because the more we amplify voices of truth and dignity, the louder they become, not through screaming, but through solidarity. Because in the end, it isn't just her reply that went viral. It's the lesson we choose to carry with us. And that lesson is clear. Calm can be louder than chaos.